Happy Tuesday, aviation enthusiasts. Welcome back to another episode of Ask an Ambassador. Right over there, I've got the fabulous Kay Sunrum, and doesn't she look fabulous tonight? And Pat Brown from Houston, Texas, and doesn't he look fabulous too? And of course, I'm Jamie Beckett in Florida, kind of shiny because the Humidity Festival kicked off this week. Get here early because it's only 9 months long. You don't want to miss a day of it. Hey, tonight, wait, I almost missed the most important part. Donnie McKay is producing this program. Yeah, Donnie McKay, you probably heard about him when they did the last Emmy Awards. I think there was a mention of his name somewhere in the technical thing. Donnie's the king. So the reason this all works, thank you, Donnie. Tonight, we're going to talk about loss of control. And of course, you can talk about just about anything you want, and we'll answer those questions. But loss of control is what we're going to be talking about. And loss of control doesn't mean somebody who's doing a lam shavak in a show. It can be a really benign seeming maneuver that leads to loss of control accidents. So, Pat, Kay, tell me your story. What's happening, Pat? Do you have any kind of background with loss of control? I know as a flight instructor, as a DPE, you must have seen every mistake that could possibly happen.
Yeah, just about. You know, I always wondered how people could put themselves in the position of the classic stall spin. Where you've overshot the runway and you're banking more steeply to make that button hook back to the runway, and just how in the world people could put themselves in that position, or more importantly, not know how to get out of the incipient stage of a stall when it happens, and I learned that lesson, and I came to a profound understanding of that. Several years ago, I was doing a tail wheel endorsement for a young lady here in Houston. She was flying a Scout. And for those of you who don't know what a Scout is, it's basically a souped up decathlon, or it's kind of the station wagon kind of version of the decathlon. It's a non-aerobatic bush plane, essentially. And I'm climbing in the back seat and looking, because I'd never flown a Scout before, got a bunch of decathlon time, never flown a Scout before. And I'm looking around, and up here in the right-hand thing, it says intentional spins are prohibited. So, okay, so that went in one ear, out the other, because we weren't going to be doing spins. And we went up to 4,000 feet or so, and we were doing stalls, and she was doing a really, really good job of doing stall recovery. And I said, let's do one more. And she pulled it back up and kicked it. We got the stall going, and the airplane just broke into a spin, just that quick. And she went like this, and I grabbed the stick and slammed into the opposite rudder, and we kept spinning. And I'm thinking, well, maybe that's the reason that placard's up there. And then I realized that I hadn't released the back pressure on the stick. And as soon as I released the back from the stick, we flew out of that spin. Now, I had been in dozens, if not hundreds, of spins before that, but the key was I was expecting them. And this one caught me by surprise. And that right there was the aha moment where I understood when somebody does get caught in that little incipient stage of the spin, when they're doing that stalled spin, that button hook back to final, why they die. Because the first reaction, if you're not expecting it, is back like this on the yoke. So anyway, that's my kind of my personal loss of control story.
Yeah, and just in English, incipient phase just means that first turn or two as you're just rolling into it where you've stalled it. And I think that's worth talking about, Kay. Our students very often really don't get why we're doing power off stalls, power on stalls, accelerated stalls, things like that. It's not to prove how cool we are being able to do a stall. It's demonstrating that we can recover from the stall. And as Pat said, prevent that spin, because if you're stalled and yawing, if you're uncoordinated, this could get ugly. Any experience with that, Kay, with students who just maybe don't get the point is not to stall. The point is to recover from the stall.
Right. Well, in our training, we emphasize why we're doing a lot of the maneuvers, right? For stalls, there's several different types of stalls, and when we practice, power off stalls, it's because we're trying to mimic the airspeed decay on final, but we're doing it up at altitude, and so you get a feel for the controls, and that's extremely important that you hear the sound and you can feel the mushiness on the controls, and we do that at altitude, and then we bring it into the traffic pattern. Or when we're doing power on stall, well, why are we doing it? Well, it's to mimic the takeoff procedure or go around, and so all of those different maneuvers just make sure that you really understand why. And then why do we do a power off stall with a turn? Well,
Yeah.
it's to mimic the base to final, and that is something that gets us every single year, that base to final, overshooting final, trying to correct it, cross controlling, you're at really low altitude, and then you stall spin, and nobody is good enough to recover from a base to final turn where you stall spin because there just isn't enough altitude. And so that's why
Yeah.
we practice that up at altitude so that you know one, not to do that. You know how to fly a proper traffic pattern. And so there's reasons for doing these power on, power off stalls with various configurations because they all mimic what we're doing around the traffic pattern.
Yeah,
I
you
like
know,
it. You're absolutely right, Kay. By the way, I got to say hey to Mike B from Maryland. He tells us in the comments, hey, Mike B. By the way, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Because we do get folks from all over the world, and it's kind of interesting, and it makes us all feel good. So seriously, put in the comments where you're from and maybe what the weather's like, because we're in that time of year where it could be anything. Pat, let's talk a little about specifics where lots of control happens. And as I said in the opening, it's not somebody who's doing an aerobatic routine and loses it. It's somebody who thinks they're flying a normal profile, just cruising along or getting into the pattern, and that's where they lose it. And let's talk, for instance, about takeoffs. And you'd think, well, you're not going to lose control taking off. And I'll tell you one place I've seen this as a risk, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. Sometimes you get people that take off and they just get in ground effect and build up speed for the whole length of the runway. And then they just haul back on the controls at the end of the runway and do a steep climb. And it's all kinds of impressive. But if you don't understand what the critical angle of attack is and at what rate you can pitch up based on your speed and all that, you really could end up finding yourself, even though you're well above what you think is stall speed, you could end up stalling that airplane with all the power in and all the pitch up and left turning tendency. That's just going to turn real ugly real fast. Can you think of an example of a takeoff situation where somebody might get into a loss of control situation?
well, first of all, hello, and a big shout out to Ted McDavitt, my buddy out of Sugar Land, Texas. He's got a real sweet bonanza down there. You know, specifically, it really, I think, has more to do with ground effect. I remember years ago, I was doing a flight review for a guy in a, oh, and there's Carlos Montalva, too. I did a check ride for him a while back. There was a guy in a J3. I was doing a flight review for a guy in a J3. And I said, hey, let's do a short field takeoff. And he hauled that thing off way, way sooner than it was ready to fly. And it starts to mush and wobble around. And I mean, it's doing like this. And he just says, you have the controls. So thanks a lot. And, you know, I got the nose down and the wind was blowing us. It blew us off the runway. We were in the air, blew us off the runway, barely missed the runway lights. I found out later that there was some sort of a pool going on by people that were watching from the terminal and watching this happen. Apparently, there was some sort of a pool going on as to whether we're going to make it or not. But you know, try to do a short field takeoff, for example, where you've got to get that airplane, or excuse me, a soft field takeoff, where you've got to get that airplane down into the ground effect. If you don't get that down enough, that'll do it. You know, you said, I think if I heard you right, you said something about it doesn't happen all that often or something to that effect. But if we look at the 2019 NAL report, NALL, for those of you that may not know what we're talking about, it's essentially an annual report that's put out by AOPA. Thank you, Donnie. That chronicles all of the accidents that have happened. Now, it takes between 16 and 20 months or thereabouts for the NTSB to issue their final reports. So while we do have numbers for 2021, the actual official numbers are based from 2019. But there were 39 takeoff and climb loss of control accidents in 2019. 2 of those were fatal. So, in the scheme of things, it's not a huge number, but it's 39 insurance claims and 2 fatalities or 2 fatal accidents out of that. So, we might think it's not all that likely to happen, but the stats say otherwise.
Yeah, you're right. I kind of misspoke when I say it doesn't happen often. That's a relative term. By the way, though, I got to give a big shout out to Jennifer Johnson. Jennifer Johnson is the first person watching tonight who answered as she was asked. She's in Salem, Oregon, and it's marginal VFR. So, Jennifer, you have to email ambassadors@aopa.org, and I'm going to send you this hat because you're so cool. You actually did what we asked you to do. You were first, and I'm sorry, being first counts, doesn't it? I saw a NASCAR race, and apparently that's important. So thank you, Jennifer. But Susie Richards and David Dolly also did. West Texas, clear skies and warm. Pat, I count on you to check him out, make sure that's true.
Well, I can tell you from experience here, because my buddy Martin Kassenbaum is also on, and it's Houston's 800 overcast, and I can tell you that it's 800 overcast today.
So where's everyone on the West Coast? I don't see anyone tuned in California here.
Oh, yeah, we got to get some California people.
It probably takes a while for the free electrons to get that far over on the left side of the continent. Okay, let's talk about prevention. And maybe this is misunderstood by some people in the piloting community. We don't talk about accidents because we love horror stories or because we're gory or we celebrate them. We talk about them to learn why these happen. And, I used a term about angle of attack and critical angle of attack when you're doing that high-speed pass and pulling back. Can you explain in layman's terms, Kay, what's the difference between angle of attack and critical angle of attack, and why do we really have to understand that as pilots?
Absolutely, that's a really important term, and we have an image here, the anatomy of a wing. Can we just pop that up? Thank you, Donnie. So this goes back to a very beginning as a student pilot. I might remember all these terms. Hopefully, you do. Just real quick. So leading edge, that's the portion of the wing that meets the air first, right? And the trailing edge is the back edge of the wing. And you remember the term chord line? So it's an imaginary line. It's an imaginary straight line that's drawn from the leading edge to the trailing edge. It doesn't necessarily have to go through the airfoil because you might have your wings down. Your flaps down, and that's going to change that chord line. But the angle of attack, that's the angle between the chord line of the wing and the direction of the relative wind. And remember, the relative wind is always exactly opposite to the direction that the aircraft is moving. So you can see that orange shaded part. As the angle of attack increases, the wing's going to produce more lift up to a certain point. When you get to that point, then the wing is going to stall, and the wing will stall at the same AOA, angle of attack. Airspeed and pitch can vary. There's this common misperception that my pitch attitude equals my angle of attack, and that's not true. So this is an important concept, and this comes straight out of our Air Safety Institute presentation on it's part of the Focus Flight Review called Positive Aircraft Control, and this is the aerodynamics section. If we look at, do we have that other image, Donnie? One with, the laminar flow. So that's that top image, but when you exceed the critical angle of attack, you can see the bottom image where the airflow is actually separating from the surface. So essentially the air can no longer flow smoothly over the wing because you've reached the critical AOA, and then the wing stalls. So what we want you to do is get a feel for the controls when that's happening. And it's going to happen at different airspeeds and different configurations. This is why we go out and we practice with our flight instructor at least every 24 months. Hopefully you're doing it every year. That's what we recommend. And we want you to get that feel for all the different configurations. And how does it feel when we get into a power off stall, power on stall while we're turning? So the control will feel mushy, right? You've heard that term before. But that's the AOA, the critical angle of attack. That's what you really need to understand.
Yeah, and loss of control is really kind of a euphemism for exceeding the critical angle of attack, stalling the airplane, like Pat's story earlier, unexpectedly. Let me use an aid here. This is a P-40 Warhawk, a very cool airplane. I happen to love these, but if we're cruising along like this, the relative wind is right here, so we might only have a 2 or 3 degree nose up attitude, and we're way far away from the critical angle of attack. But if we do that dramatic pull up that we were talking about, well, the relative wind is in relation to the direction the airplane is traveling, not the way it's pointing. So a pilot might do that dramatic high-speed pull up thinking they're really cool. Well, the relative wind is here, and the wing now way exceeds that angle of attack. And because of, if you're at a high power setting, it's going to roll off to the left, and you get into that incipient phase of a spin that Pat was talking about, which can of course develop into a full-blown spin very quickly. And as I recall, Pat, last time I did a spin in a 152, it was about an 800-foot loss in that first turn. It stabilizes after that, but in your experience, pretty big altitude loss in that first turn, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, it really once it starts really wrapping up into the spin. Of course, it goes a lot quicker than that. But yeah, you can lose several hundred feet very, very quickly. I still go up. I've got a partnership in decathlon. I still go up periodically and spin it to the left and to the right, just to keep my chops up. If somebody wants to go up and see what a spin looks like, I want to at least have, done some recently. And yeah, you'll lose, I don't know. I think 800 feet is probably a little excessive if you know it's coming. Yeah, you can recover in less time than that. But if you don't know it's coming, I mean, that's, again, back to that original story that I told you, that's when you can, when it can get bad. One other quick story about the dangers of cross controlling, which is typically why that happens on that button hook back to a final approach. I was training a tow pilot at our glider club once, and he kept overshooting the final approach course, and I finally said, okay, we got to go up and get some duels. So I took him up in a Citabria, and I intentionally put us into a cross-controlled stall as if you would be coming back to the runway. And when the airplane broke, it went over the top and into an opposite direction spin. And I believe he created some new swear words. And
yeah, I can see that happening. I could.
Yeah, if you're not coordinated, when you're practicing those stalls, bad things can happen, and it's imperative that we train for that. But what? Here's what bothers me as a CFI, and I suspect the two of you probably feel the same way. We're taught as flight instructors, we're taught, retard the throttle, pull the nose back, stall the airplane, nose down, power back, reestablish the airflow, all that stuff. Whether it's a power on or power off stall, I mean, basically the recovery is the same. Lower the nose, reattach the air, off you go. The problem is in real life, that's not the way it happens. It happens unexpectedly. And like that spin did to me, and that's bothered me, and I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer for that. Maybe you guys, because you're smarter than I am. Maybe you do, but when I was teaching gliders, I mean, it was routine that we would be in a 45 or 50 degree bank angle thermaling, and now you are right on the ragged edge of a stall. at that bank angle, you're at the ragged edge of a stall, you're pulling extra G's on the airplane, and you're right close to the critical angle of attack. And if you're kind of expecting that it might happen, but even when it does, there's still a little bit of a ooh, I got to recover. But we train those people, those glider pilots. We train those people to do stalls in a 45-degree bank angle, or at least I did. And so when you did lose it at a 45-degree bank angle, the yaw string, and there's no ball. The yaw string was always straight on the windscreen, and as a result, it was really just a normal accelerated stall recovery. But I have never liked the way we teach stalls. I just am not smart enough to figure out a better way to do it to basically surprise the applicant.
Well, let's go out to the viewers too. Put in the comments. Have you ever inadvertently stalled an aircraft or heard the horn go off unexpectedly where you didn't think it was going to happen? Because Pat's point is a good one. I mean, when you're not expecting something to happen, that's an issue. And I'd like to discuss that, Pat, a little farther down when we get to the landing accidents, loss of control accidents. Sure. I'll share one more takeoff loss of control. And it might not be something that people would think of as a loss of control accident, but I think it is. Many years ago, I was instructing at a flight school in Connecticut, single runway airport, 1836. And a fellow brought his family out about this time of year, beginning of spring. His airplane had sat at a tie down for months with the snow on it and everything. Brought his family out to go flying, loaded them in, no pre-flight, just untied it, started it up, went out to the hold short line, no run up, started going down the runway. He did everything wrong you could do wrong. And his biggest problem was because he hadn't done a pre-flight, he didn't remove the pitot cover. So as he got down the runway, he realized he didn't have any airspeed registering. So he pulled the power, but he didn't add brakes. So he wasn't slowing down. So he put power in, but he did add brakes. And he repeated this a few times. Obviously, he's not making progress. He's just using up runway. And as he got to about 3/4 of the way down the runway, he just horsed this thing up into the air, and it did fly in ground effect. Problem is, I live on a sandbar now. It's absolutely flat in Florida. It's like Kansas. We don't have a problem with this. But in New England, and this was the case at our airport, at the end of the runway, the terrain dropped off dramatically. And he was only in the air because of ground effect. As soon as the ground sloped away, the airplane descended. He went down into that ravine, tore the gear off, opened up the fuel bladders. Luckily, nobody was killed. But that is a loss of control accident. You forced the airplane into the air before it's ready to fly. You weren't prepared to do anything. And this kind of goes to your point, Pat, where something unexpected happens. Steps were skipped. The pre-flight was skipped. The run-up was skipped. The getting yourself in the right headspace to fly was skipped. We just go with the automatic. Well, this is what's happened the last 800 times I've done this, so I guess it's going to work out. That's not always the case. So I just share that because I think it's worth realizing it's not just stalling. There are a number of different scenarios that could be classified as loss of control, but they're almost always because the pilot kind of took their eye off the ball, intentionally or unintentionally.
Well, I like that example that you gave because there's I've seen a number of times where pilots move from one airplane to a higher performance airplane, and on their first takeoff, they don't realize how that airplane is going to just drift off if you don't put the right rudder, for example.
Yeah,
if you go from a Cessna 152 and you jump into a 182. Your takeoff is going to be very different. And so you could have loss of control there. So I think it was Ed who mentioned earlier that this is not, loss of control is not about stalls.
Yeah.
That's one component. There's lots of ways. It's just you losing control of the airplane. And we've talked a couple of examples about takeoff. And that's an extremely critical phase of flight. And so you have to be vigilant on flying by the numbers and understanding the airplane and the performance and what you need to do to counteract different forces as you are departing the runway and what happens after there.
You don't have to look any further. To your point, Kay, you don't have to look any further than the JFK accident, 15 years ago or so. clearly a case of loss of control, and it was the spiral that turned in essentially to just straight into the water at 6,000 feet a minute. As Ed pointed out, we've been focusing a little bit on stalls and angle of attack, but it is certainly not just that. And
Right.
So unfortunately, we were unable to get Ed actually contributed a video for tonight, but we couldn't make it play. But it was a case of the spiral. But so Ed, sorry we couldn't make it play.
Hey, and Donnie, can you put up that pilots involved? I think it's F-18. Nobody's immune. This is kind of an interesting graphic because it tells us the certification level of pilots who were involved in accidents, and what really ought to catch our eye is two things, in my opinion. Private pilots account for 44% of the accidents, 41% of the fatal accidents. That's a high percentage. And as a private pilot, we really should be on the ball and be aware. I kind of need to up my game, but nobody can really point a finger at anybody else, because you'll notice every certification level, even with a CFI on board, people have accidents, and a number of those are loss of control accidents. Thank you, Donnie. So it's really imperative on us that no matter what level of certification you're at, from student pilot to ATP, whether you're flying solo or whether you've got another pilot with you or whether you've got a CFI on board, you've got to stay in the game mentally. And that's where I want to go with the next part, Pat, go rounds. Now, we all do these as student pilots. I generally have people do it on a flight review. It's not that big a deal. And it is surprising to me how few people actually practice them. And over a period of time of not practicing them, they're not very good at it. They really kind of get behind the 8 ball as they do it. Have you experienced anything like that?
Oh, yeah. It depends a little bit on how you have the airplane configured. But if you are stabilized on an approach, especially with full flaps, and you have to go around, you better be prepared to add some forward pressure to the yoke, because that nose is going to pitch up, because you're trimmed for a fairly low airspeed. And what's going to happen when you get that big blast of the propeller prop wash over the elevator and that airplane starts to accelerate, it's trimmed for a slower speed. So it's going to pitch up to try to maintain that slower speed. So that's the infamous trim stall that people talk about. And the other thing is that they're much too anxious, or much more, I guess anxious is the right word, to get those flaps up and to clean the airplane up. Wait a second, get stabilized before you start cleaning the airplane up, and then do it in a logical manner. In other words, we're not taking 40 degrees of flaps out of the airplane, just put up the switch and let it go. It's a few degrees at a time until we build up enough airspeed that we've got that airplane clearly under control. But yeah, go-arounds can turn out ugly. And then of course, remember, traditionally speaking, if you're going to go around, you want to sidestep to the right just a little bit so that you can look down off the left-hand side of the airplane, see anything under you on the airport that might have caused that go around. So you've got that hazard in sight, and it's another airplane perhaps maybe coming up. To keep it from coming up underneath you, you want to sidestep over here a little bit. So I hope that answered your question.
I believe it did, but I'm going to go to Kay, and Kay, I'm going to combine something you said and something Pat said. Pat made a really interesting point about you've got to get stabilized. Your job in a go-around is not to immediately start climbing, because you're low and you're slow and you're dirty. So you've got to clean it up and get stabilized. But you made a really good point the other day. Well, not the other day. Moments ago. I'm sorry, I'm elderly. Going from a 152 to a 182, or a Cherokee 180 to a Cirrus SR22. Adding that power in is a whole other thing when you're going from 180 horsepower to 320 horsepower, or from 110 horsepower to 235. That get stabilized thing is no joke. So what we're trying to do, and see if you agree with me on this, I want to level off, then I want to clean up, then I want to climb. Would you say that's pretty accurate? And unfortunately, some people go directly to climb, back to my P40, where they're coming in and they just go immediately like that, where they're dirty. this isn't going to work out.
Yeah, but you want to be stabilized the whole time and be very procedural with it. So you're going to pitch up, you're going to power, pitch up, clean up, and then a lot of times people will communicate first, and that should be the last thing that you do. You don't need to tell anybody on the ground that you're going around before you actually start the procedure. And I probably hear it 3 out of 4 times, the person saying going around before you actually even see them do anything.
Yeah.
So the other thing I want to point out on go-arounds is it should be part of your pre-landing checklist. What am I, just a reminder, what am I going to do for go-arounds? Because some airports you might not be able to do just a side step over to the right. Depends on what traffic is. And if you are using automation, and Ed, you must have been reading my mind with your comment there. If you do have an autopilot on, disengaging it is something that you need to know, well, what's going to happen next? Or if you're on an approach, what buttons do you push to engage the missed approach procedure? It is not always that intuitive, and the more sophisticated avionics that you have, the more you have to practice those procedures on the ground and then in the air before you actually have to do it, because we don't go around that often and we don't shoot that many missed approaches.
Yeah,
well, we're coming into fly-in season, and I've got to say, we're a month out today. We're a month out from Sun and Fun, and we've all been there, and I'll be there again. To your point, Kay, when you're flying into a place that busy, AirVenture or Sun and Fun or something like that, you've got to have in your mind, I'm trying to do what they're instructing me to do, land on the dot, land on the right piece of pavement, whatever. But you've got to have in mind, this could be a go-around if the person in front of me dawdles or it doesn't work out like expected. Where am I going to go, and what's the traffic look like there? You make a really good point, Kay. We've got to be thinking ahead of where we are right now and the assumption of where we're going to be in 15 seconds. We have to be thinking down the road. This could go a whole other way, and we have to be prepared for that.
Yeah, you should assume every landing is going to be, you're going to do a go around, and every approach is going to be a missed approach. You need to have that mindset.
I'll tell you, my first attempt at a solo landing was a go-around, and I've told this story. Maybe I've told it here, but I was stupid high on the first time around, and I had flaps out, and I'm slipping it, and I just realized this is dumb. I'm not set up for this, and I went around, and I was embarrassed. It's my first try at a solo landing ever, so I went around. I came back. I was much better set up. I was configured right, had my airspeed right. I landed, and as I rolled out, the tower called and said, "Is that your first solo?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Great job on the go-round." And that just puffed up my confidence that the thing I thought was a failure was the right thing to do. Don't force yourself into something, whether that's forcing the landing or excitedly forcing yourself into a go-around. It can be a very methodical thing. All you got to do is stop the descent. And Pat, I think that's something that people don't consciously think about. There's an airplane on the runway and it hasn't cleared it. I'm not really good to land. I don't have to climb. I just have to stop descending. If I'm 100 feet in the air, I'm fine. And as you say, if I can get over to the right side, that's great. But would you agree that if I take the methodical approach, arrest my descent, start building airspeed, start cleaning up, and then climb back and into the pattern, that's really the thing I'm looking for?
Yeah, that's the technique that's gonna save your life if you do it properly like that. Yeah, assuming everything is working properly in the airplane, the only time you absolutely must land is when you run out of gas. I mean, that's really the only time you got to worry about it. And one of the Kay, and you mentioned the issue about a 150 versus like a 182 or something like that. A huge issue when you're going from a relatively low horsepower airplane, let's take the extreme, like a J3 or something like that, and then you transition up to something big like a 206 or a Centurion or a Cirrus or some big airplane like that, is when you add the power to go around, or even when you add power to recover from power off stall, there is a significant amount of yaw. And if you don't get that right rudder in there, and if you're low and slow and dirty, and for some reason you do get a little bit of a bobble of a stall, and you've got that ball way out to the right because you didn't kick in enough right rudder against that yaw, there you go. There's again, talking about a stall spin situation, but you got to be ready for the yaw too.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I like Martin Kassenbaum's comment. I was shocked with the left turning tendency in my first takeoff in the Saratoga turbocharged, because there's a huge amount of power there. We hear about left turning tendency. We're talking about takeoffs, especially because we're at high power, high pitch attitude, low airspeed. And some people, they say they're compensating for it, but you're flying a 152 or a Cherokee 140, they don't even really feel it. But yeah, as you get up into bigger, more powerful aircraft, it really becomes a thing. Let's talk about loss of control on landing, because just like takeoff loss of control or go-around loss of control, there's a multitude of things that can happen. But, Kay, you were talking about being prepared for what-if situations. Just the reality of crosswinds, which we deal with all the time, where people cut their base in tight and they're not really established on final very well, and they haven't gauged the crosswind. And even if you're in control all the way to touchdown, but there are people who go off the runway, hit a sign, go into a ditch because they couldn't handle the crosswind that they really weren't actively thinking about.
Yeah. Well, the landing, it starts on downwind. You really should think of your landing on downwind and gauge where the winds are coming from. You should be able to tell, right? Am I keeping the heading? Am I being blown away from the runway or being pushed towards the runway? That gives you a good sign of where the winds are coming from. And you have to be set up, fly by the numbers. I say that again and again and again. So if you're in a 172, it's 90, 80, 70, right? 90 on downwind, then 80 on base, 70 on final, then slow down to 65, and then you bleed off the airspeed. So you want to make sure that you are configured to do the same thing again and again. Your instructor probably taught you from day one, your beam the numbers, first notch of flap, pitch down, and then shoot for the next airspeed. So if you do that and you don't cut the corners, your landing is most likely going to be better, because you have you're really managing the energy management, speed management. You're configured properly, and it starts in the downwind. I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Pat.
No, I was just going to say that's an excellent point. I have heard folks, say that they want to be perfect, and first of all, perfection isn't the standard that we're going to ever be able to get, but a standard that we can all achieve, and I think I've said this on this broadcast more than once, is consistency. We'll never achieve perfection, although we can certainly strive for it. We'll never achieve it, but we can achieve consistency. And with what Kay said is, in terms of it all starts on the downwind, is absolutely right. If your traffic pattern is 1,000 feet AGL, which is what most of them are, then that doesn't mean 950 feet. It doesn't mean 1,050 feet. It means 1,000 feet. And yes, I understand there's updrafts and downdrafts and all that kind of stuff, but we still can strive for a consistent 1,000-foot traffic pattern. Maybe in our particular airplane, whatever it might be, in my 182, for example, beam the numbers on the approach into the runway. I'm coming back from 15 inches to usually around 12 or 13, and put in the first notch of flaps, and then and that's going to slow me down to because I'm trimmed first of all for 90 knots. It's going to slow me down to a predetermined speed. I know what it's going to be when I put in that first notch of flaps. Now I'm looking over my shoulders. Is it time to turn base yet? And that's going to depend on what the wind is doing to you. If you got a tailwind on the downwind leg and it's a strong one, you might want to turn base a little quicker. If you've got a crosswind off your right wing, you might want to, or the left wing for that matter, you might need to just kind of extend a little bit, or perhaps not, just so that you can gauge, where you are and what you need to do with your power and additional flaps. But it all starts with a downwind leg, and consistency is absolutely attainable.
Yeah, Jennifer Johnson's got a great comment here, not just because she's getting a cool hat, but she's got a great comment. I was taught to set the heading bug to the wind direction when getting ATIS or the weather report. Helps to visualize where the wind is coming from. Yeah, you're not cruising, so the heading bug isn't necessary in the pattern. That's a great idea, just as a visual reminder. And really, if we're going to start at the downwind, and that is where the whole landing thing really gets its information. It works out based on you're doing this well from the downwind on or you're not. I had a guy years ago that I did a flight review with, and he owned a Dakota, and he was the nicest guy, and he was a reasonably good pilot, good flight review, but his landings were all over the place. I mean, sometimes he was right down on the number, sometimes he touched down 2,000 feet down the runway. And I asked him about it. He said, "Yeah, my landings aren't very consistent, and I don't know why." And I said, "Well, it's because your airspeed and configuration isn't standardized. I mean, sometimes you're at 85 on final, sometimes you're at 70 on final, sometimes you've got flaps in, sometimes you don't. There's nothing consistent about it." And I demonstrated a couple, and he realized, oh, that's it. And to his credit, he did not ask me to sign him up for the flight review. We went flying another time just to work on the landings. But Kay, that configuration and expectation of airspeeds thing, that's a really big component. And I'm talking here about that dreaded base to final stall spin, which is unfortunately a common accident. It really is a big killer because the impact angle is nearly vertical. It's usually fatal. And it's so preventable if we just know our airspeeds and our configurations and we set our pattern to an appropriate size. It's kind of what you were talking about just being consistent.
Right. And just learn what your performance numbers are. A certain pitch and a certain airspeed will give you certain performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you need to know what that is for your airplane. And the base to final that scenario, it blows my mind how year after year that is a leading cause of fatal accidents, but it can be completely avoidable if you fly the traffic pattern the way you're supposed to, and you know your airplane, you know your numbers, and you're disciplined and doing it at the right time. It's all about the timing, right? When do you turn base? When do you turn final? Anticipate the winds. And then do it. And if you overshoot, don't try to correct it. Go around. It is okay. all of us have overshot the final, right? We all have. I think every single pilot has. If they say they haven't, they're lying. All right. So you've overshot. So big deal. Go around.
Pat, we spoke about that earlier. I'm so glad Kay brought it up. It's not just getting too slow. It's not just having the wrong configuration, but that overshooting the runway, flying past the final fix, and then tightening up the turn, banking heavier. That's what really gets people sometimes, isn't it? They increase the bank because they want to get back over, but then they get kind of cheat out some bank because it's freaking them out, and they kick in a bunch of rudder, and now you're low and slow and uncoordinated. It's bad scene, wouldn't you say?
Well, yeah. I mean, that kind of goes back to the very beginning when we were talking about that unexpected spin. But to piggyback on that, whenever you're making a bank in an airplane, the lift vector is such that the nose wants to drop, and if you don't compensate for that, now you're speeding up. And it can develop into what Ed has mentioned here, a spiral type of situation that perhaps starts out at a slow speed, but rapidly increases to a higher speed, because if you don't react by adding some back pressure, then you are speeding up. And of course, if you do recover, the airplane is going to tend to want to balloon, which means now the nose is pitching way up. And if you're that far out of control, just nothing good is going to happen from that.
Yeah. And if we go back to the fabulous P40 pointing right at you, when I'm on my base leg, my lift vector is entirely vertical. All the lift is applied vertically based on speed and angle of attack. But when I roll into that turn to turn final, some of my lift goes horizontal, which means that vertical lift component is reduced. I have to increase angle of attack, even if it's not conscious. I have to increase angle of attack to maintain that same altitude or that same descent rate. And as I do that, Joe McMurray has an interesting point. Anytime you bank, G-load increases incrementally. It's just the way it is. So as I make that turn from base to final, I'm increasing angle of attack. I'm getting closer to my critical angle of attack. If I'm slow, if I'm misconfigured, if I fly through final and I try and bring it back, all of those are things that can be bad. I say we vote for K and just do the go round. Keep your speed a little high. And K, this is just, it might be a bad habit of mine. It might be a good safety feature. I'm not sure. I'm going to turn to you on this. I tend to be 5 knots fast on final throughout the pattern. I tend to be 5 knots fast and a little high because I would rather be high and fast than low and slow, especially if I'm at an airport that I'm not familiar with, where I would really rather not get myself right into it. Example being the first time I ever went to St. Augustine, Florida. Back then it was a non-towered airport, but it had Navy wires, arresting wires at the end of the runway. If you landed right on the numbers there, you were going to lose some parts.
Yeah. And there's another. I've lost my train of thought now. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say one thing about just the traffic pattern in general. Make sure that you're trimmed. You should never be manhandling the yoke or the stick. You should be able to fly with just a couple of fingers. And you'll see that in newer pilots or pilots that are nervous that they will hold on so much as if that's going to make a difference.
Yeah.
It doesn't, right? It doesn't matter how strong you are. I mean, there's no exercise involved here, right? So be really light on the controls and be trimmed. And that could, in and by itself, solve some of the space to final problems, because most of those people they're not trimmed and they are not holding on to the yoke lightly because they are overcorrecting. So next time you fly, be really light on the controls.
Okay, I just saw a post on social media where a young woman who was learning to fly was asking a question because her instructor had told her not to trim in the pattern. And she was asking, is that normal? And I disagreed. Trim for everything. There's no reason you should be fighting the controls. Trim for climb out, trim for level off, trim for final, trim for everything. I really appreciate you saying that, because some people put themselves in the position because they think it's unmanly or unprofessional or whatever it is. There's no reason to have to manhandle the controls, is there, Pat? I mean, the point is to be in control, not getting tired and working hard.
Yeah, if you're walking away from the airplane and your arm is sore, you didn't do a good job with the trim.
Yeah, I'm basically lazy, kind of like you, Jamie. I don't want to work any harder than I have to, so I'm going to trim it. You had talked about carrying a little bit of extra speed. I don't know about that. We could probably have a conversation offline about that. But being high, on the other hand, if you're flying the kind of airplanes most of us fly most of the time, and let's just say that you're following the VASI or the PAPI down, and you've got 2 reds and 2 whites, or 1 red, 1 white, depending on what you're looking at. And you're, let's say, a half a mile from the runway, 3/4 mile from the runway on the glide slope. In most general aviation airplanes, if you lose an engine at that point, you're down in the weeds before the runway. You're not going to make the runway because those glide slopes are somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees most of the time. And most general aviation airplanes, engine out, don't have a 3 to 4 degree glide slope as a glider. They just don't. Yeah. So I tend, like you, to fly. I might find where 4 white lights are, and then just maybe I'll come down and find out where the one of them turns red, and then I'll just go back up just a little bit. Maybe keep those 4 white lights all the way down. If I'm in VFR conditions, if I'm on an instrument approach, that's a little different. But
Pat,
I'm going to talk about one variable. David Dawley has a great question here. What about carrying a little speed for a buffer? What's reasonable? In all honesty, David, it depends on where you are. When I talk about carrying an extra 5 knots or so, I'm flying a 152 into a 5,000-foot runway. I could touch down 2/3 of the way down and I'm fine. However, if I'm flying over to my friend's grass strip, which is 2,000 feet and grass, I'm on speed and on configuration and on the ground in the first couple 100 feet. I just don't have a whole lot to use. So you do have to put some thought into what kind of a runway am I on? What kind of length do I need? Is there an obstacle? There's a whole lot of thought that goes into it. So you're right, Pat. I think just like paper charts or digital, we went back and forth on that for a while. I think we can have a really spirited conversation on this, but I don't think you got to be so religiously perfect every time where it's one number. It's just that number. There are variations. I will throw one other thing in, though, that, Kay, I'm coming to you on this. I think when we're landing, to prevent loss of control, one of the things we can proactively do is believe in that center line. Don't touch down on the runway. Aim to touch down and maintain the center line, especially when there's a crosswind, because if you're not dedicated to touching on the center line and you touch down 40 feet to the left of it, now you're just on one half of the runway. And if you start drifting, this can get pretty ugly. What is your thought on just keying on the center line and making sure you touch down on it every time?
It's a must. That has to be not a lofty goal. That is a very basic goal of every pilot, is to have that longitudinal directional control, especially when you're coming into landing. And if you have a gusty wind situation, then extend your downwind if that's possible, and give yourself longer time on final so you can make sure that you're stabilized. And this is where it might be wise to add some extra knots. They say half the gust factor, add that to your approach speed, right? And come in and see where you're going. If it's at a point where you are doing a crosswind landing with the techniques, and you're still not able to maintain that directional control, that means you can't land at that airport. That means you have exceeded your crosswind component, and you got to go somewhere else. So it should be a goal, a basic goal, every single landing.
Well, it's not just that, Kay, but if you look at the ACS very clearly states that the applicant demonstrates that he or she can land the airplane with the longitudinal axis of the airplane lined up with basically with the heading of the runway, and they touch down smoothly on the center line. I mean, that's not quite verbatim what it says, but that's basically saying you got to be on the center line and not with any side load on the landing gear. It actually brings that up too in the ACS, without side load on the gear. Yeah. So not only is it a good aspiration, but it's actually in the ACS.
And there's a lot of runways out here that are not that wide. There might be 50 feet wide. So
I'll tell you, I once landed on the shuttle landing strip out at the Space Center. It's 100 yards wide, but there was a 14-knot direct crosswind. Having a center line to key on kept me from just wandering loose all over this thing. It really does help. By the way, we're talking about trim. Jim Porterfield, my good buddy, who is a corporate pilot and a CFI, says, I teach my students to trim every time a power adjustment is made. Not bad advice, in my opinion. Let's go on to one other thing, because we've talked about takeoffs and we've talked about landing, but a certain number of loss of control accidents come from screwing around. And I hate to say that, but there are people who don't appreciate how remarkable it is to be flying, and they decide they're bulletproof and I'll just go do whatever I want. When I was in flight school, and this made a real impression on me, a different flight school in another part of the state, an instructor took a student and they were doing low altitude steep turns over his girlfriend's house. And as you guys know, you get into that big bank angle, you get up to 60 degrees and now you're at 2 Gs and your stall speed is way up and you've increased the bank angle. That's exactly what happened. They stalled at a steep turn at low altitude. That's generally not recoverable, and it wasn't in their situation. That tendency we want to have to go out into the practice area and hedge hop, get down low, fly through fields at 20 feet because I'm more than 500 feet from buildings and people, just not a good idea. And that's a personal opinion, but Pat, what do you think about that? I think you're asking for trouble. It's just a matter of time.
I've been flying since I was 16 years old, and I'm not even going to begin to tell you how many really boneheaded things that I probably did. when I was 16, 17, 18 years old, because I was young, stupid, bulletproof. And, as I've gotten to be a little older than that and realize that there is this is a finite time we have on Earth, I have found that I've gotten a whole lot more conservative about the way I fly. But, I did some pretty stupid things when I was 16 years old and thought I knew it all, 17 years old, thought I knew it all. And probably just divine intervention, kept me here to learn from my mistakes. But yes, bad things can happen. Anything that starts with, hey, hold my beer, somewhere, or hey, y'all, watch this. Anything that starts with those phrases, that nothing's going to come over.
Well, this is why I want to go to Kay with our closing topic, because Kay, exactly what Pat's talking about. You combine youth with testosterone and you get stupidity. That's a simple math problem. I've always thought women were generally better flight students because they're less prone to fight the machine. But what do you think aeronautical decision-making, what role do you think ADM plays in avoiding loss of control accidents?
The decision making it is so important. Your mindset, your safety mindset should be something you do on every single flight. And it doesn't matter how experienced you get. We're always making, hopefully, good decisions. But I want you to just think about all these things that we've talked about and what would you do in these different situations and how can you avoid loss of control in these different stages of these phases of flight. As far as specific things that you can do, go out and train with a CFI or even you grab a safety pilot and practice these different maneuvers. You'll be able to make better decisions in real life scenarios, all these examples that we talked about, if you've practiced them in a controlled environment. So it's about practice and it's about discipline. I think those are the two keys in the ADM for avoiding loss of control.
I'm 100% with you. I love that. Okay, thank you for putting that in. ADM is important on everything, but that's a big deal, especially in avoiding loss of control. Now, I'm talking directly to the viewers now. I'm completely ignoring Pat and Kay because I'm done with them. It's okay. Pat is very into metrics. You probably don't know this, but he is very into how many, how much, whatever. So if you enjoyed this broadcast tonight, give me a thumbs up in the comments. Just put in a little thumbs up or an okay or an exclamation mark or something to let Pat know that his time was well spent tonight. Because, the man missed dinner. This is a big deal. Kay, I want to come back to you for one more thing. We've talked a couple times about flight reviews here. Pat's a designated pilot examiner, does check rides. You and I are CFIs and do flight reviews, and I assume Pat does them too. But there is a thing called a focused flight review where you can specifically get into the things that are real risk areas. Can you tell us anything about that in a minute and a half?
Sure. So AOPA Air Safety Institute has a number of focused flight reviews, and one of them, which is very pertinent to our topic today, is on positive aircraft control. Thank you, Donnie. So this is a kneeboard size cheat sheet. Now the actual packet is, I think, 13 or 14 pages long. This is the last page here. And take advantage of this. This is on our website. You can print this out, give this to your CFI. He or she should probably know about this anyway. And just take a look at the airwork. Like, for example, the first, I know this is more of an eye chart, but I'll just let you know, your instructor will check off this first box about precise flight, about focusing on precise coordination. Another box is steep turns and varying things, airspeeds and flap settings. The third box there under airwork is about slow flight and helping you understand the change in sound and visual cues and controls and all of that. And then the fourth, and this is my last item that I'm going to talk about, is the stalls. So here's where your CFI will check off, okay, you've done power off stalls, power on stalls in these different configurations, and you'll go through the rest of the boxes that are just general in flight reviews, but it's very specific about positive aircraft control. And so take a look at that and I think that's a great one. I personally have done it, and I enjoyed it. And there's a focus on positive aircraft control. So there's that
I
website.
like it. By the way, Donnie just put up a thing about becoming an AOPA member. Let me know in the comments if you are an AOPA member. We still love you if you're not, but if you are, you know the secret handshake, and it's a whole other thing. Pat, I think Kay talking about the focus flight review is interesting because I'm thinking a whole lot of pilots, even some commercial pilots, don't know that they can go on a flight review and they can direct it to some degree. They can tell the CFI, I want to work on these things this time around.
Yeah.
That's not bad, is it? You don't have to let the CFI drive. You can have some input, can't you?
Now, any good CFI should say to you, if you're coming to them for a flight review, where do you think your weaknesses are? Where would you like to focus this flight review? And there are certain things that you're going to have to do because the regs require it. But for the most part, it's really kind of up to you to drive the ship. If you don't come to the CFI with an idea, trust me when I tell you, the CFI will have some things that you can do, but they may not be the things that you want to focus on. Let me just leave you, because I know we're running a little over time here. Let me, from my standpoint, let me leave you with one thought. Generally speaking, the airplane isn't going to do anything you don't let it do. It's an inanimate object. You are in control, and it won't do anything that you don't let it do. So loss of control can be avoided by flying the airplane, flying it properly, because it won't do anything you don't let it do.
I like it. Kay, do you have any closing words of wisdom for us? Because you always do, and I'm counting on you for the big finish here, so no pressure. But do you have anything you want to share with us as we wander off into the sunset?
Since we are over, I'll be short and sweet. You are the master of the ship.
Yeah, right? Your domain.
I know you're not talking to me. You're talking to them. I get it. Well, let me say this. I really appreciate you all tuning in tonight. I really thank Kay and Pat for taking time out to do this. We actually have fun, and we really do enjoy kind of going through these topics and seeing what each other think, because sometimes we differ slightly, and it's great. But thank you all for being a part of this tonight. And oh yeah, can I get a hi Donnie from anybody in the comments, because he's so lonely there in the bunker, and he does such a fantastic job, and we really couldn't do this without Donnie. We couldn't. And I'll leave you with this. Please share the link if you're willing, because hey, you were here. Tell people you saw it live. You guys have to suffer with the replay, but come back and see us next time. And you know, you got 3 bonus minutes tonight, and it didn't even cost extra. That's something worthwhile. Come back and see us Tuesday, March 22nd, right here, the last Ask an Ambassador before Sun and Fun. Thank you so much for being a part of this. We will see you next time. On behalf of Kay and Pat and myself, bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.